The sign appeared just after sunrise. A small piece of cardboard. Rough. Bent. Desperate. Interesting. Very interesting. Because nobody in Dry Creek had ever seen anything like it. Not even during the worst winters. Not even during the cattle crashes. Not even during the drought years. Yet there it was, placed beside the busiest street in town, where everyone could see it, where nobody could ignore it. The words were simple, painfully simple. One meal equals one night. Silence followed. Not because the street was empty, because people didn't know what to say. A wagon driver slowed his horses. A shopkeeper stopped sweeping. Two ranch hands exchanged uncomfortable looks. Nobody laughed. Not at first. The sign sat there in the morning sunlight, and beside it sat a young woman. Sarah Collins, 27 years old, widowed, hungry, exhausted, 3 days without a proper meal. Interesting, very interesting, because 6 months earlier Sarah had lived a completely different life. Not wealthy, not powerful, just normal. A small cabin, a husband named Thomas, a vegetable garden, a few chickens, simple dreams, simple happiness. Then everything changed. The fever arrived first. Quickly, brutally, without mercy. Thomas was gone within a week. The doctor tried. The preacher prayed. The neighbors hoped. Nothing helped. The grave appeared on a windy afternoon, and Sarah buried her future beside her husband. At least that was how it felt. After that came the debts, the unpaid bills, the lost property, the creditors. Interesting, very interesting, because grief rarely arrives alone. It usually brings friends, cruel friends. Within months the cabin was gone. The garden was gone. The livestock was gone. Everything disappeared one piece at a time, until all Sarah possessed fit inside a single cloth bag. She tried finding work. Everywhere. The bakery, the hotel, the laundry, the schoolhouse. Nothing. Some businesses couldn't afford help. Others preferred hiring relatives. A few simply didn't want another widow around. Eventually the money disappeared too. Then the food. Then the hope. And now, she sat beside a dirt road, holding a sign she never imagined writing. The morning crowd continued growing. Dry Creek slowly awakened. Boots crossed sidewalks. Wagons rolled past. Store doors opened. Church bells rang in the distance. Life continued, as if nothing unusual was happening. Yet nearly everyone glanced toward Sarah, then quickly looked away. Interesting. Very interesting. Because pity is uncomfortable, especially when it demands action. Most people prefer sympathy. It costs less. An older woman stopped briefly, looked at the sign, looked at Sarah, then quietly walked away. A ranch hand shook his head. Another muttered something under his breath. Nobody offered food. Nobody offered work. Nobody offered help. The hours passed slowly. The sun climbed higher. The heat increased. Sarah remained seated, trying not to cry, trying not to think, trying not to notice the stares. A little boy eventually approached, perhaps 8 years old. Curious. Children often are. He looked at the sign, then looked at Sarah. Finally he asked, "Are you hungry?" The question nearly broke her, because it was the first honest question anyone had asked all day. Sarah forced a smile, then nodded. The boy reached into his pocket, pulled out half a biscuit. Crushed. Dry. Probably his lunch. Interesting. Very interesting. Because the poorest kindness often comes from those who possess the least. Before Sarah could answer, the boy's mother hurried over. Embarrassed. Apologizing. She gently pulled him away. The biscuit disappeared with them. Sarah didn't blame her. The woman probably needed the food herself. Still, watching them leave hurt. A lot. By noon the entire town knew about the sign. News travels quickly in small places. Especially sad news. Some people claimed Sarah had gone crazy. Others said she had no choice. Most simply watched. And watching became its own form of cruelty. A group of men gathered outside the saloon. Talking. Pointing. Looking toward Sarah. The laughter started shortly afterward. Not loud. Not yet. But noticeable. The kind of laughter people use when they want to hide discomfort. Sarah heard it. Every word. Every whisper. Every joke. The humiliation settled deeper with every passing hour. Interesting. Very interesting. Because hunger hurts the body, but shame hurts something else. Something harder to heal. The afternoon sun burned overhead. The town grew hotter. Dust drifted through the streets. Sarah's stomach ached constantly now. The weakness was becoming difficult to hide. Several times she considered leaving, throwing away the sign, walking into the hills, disappearing. Anything felt better than this. Then she remembered Thomas. His voice. His smile. His final promise. Keep going. No matter what. So she stayed. One more hour. Then another. Then another. Late in the afternoon, the atmosphere changed. Subtly at first. Then noticeably. The men outside the saloon were no longer laughing. Now they were moving. Toward her. Slowly. Confidently. Like customers approaching a market stall. Interesting. Very interesting. Because Sarah suddenly realized something. The sign had done exactly what she feared. People weren't seeing a hungry woman anymore. They were seeing a price. The first man adjusted his hat. The second grinned. The third carried a bottle. None looked interested in helping. Fear settled into Sarah's chest. Cold. Heavy. Real. The street seemed quieter now. People noticed what was happening. Yet nobody stepped forward. Nobody intervened. Nobody moved. Then something unexpected happened. A distant sound echoed across Dry Creek. Horse hooves. Slow. Steady. Powerful. The men turned. The crowd turned. Even Sarah turned. At the far end of the street, a lone cowboy had just entered town. The horse continued down the street. Slowly. Steadily. Without hurry. Interesting. Very interesting. Because everyone seemed more interested in the rider than the horse. The cowboy sat tall in the saddle. Broad shoulders. Dust-covered hat. Dark coat faded by years beneath the Texas sun. Nobody recognized him. Not immediately. Dry Creek wasn't a large town. Most strangers were noticed. This one attracted attention instantly. The reason was simple. He looked like a man accustomed to difficult places and difficult decisions. Meanwhile, the men approaching Sarah never stopped walking. The first man smiled. A bad smile. The kind that rarely means anything good. He stopped directly in front of her. Then looked down. At the sign. One meal. Laughter followed. His friends seemed amused. Sarah remained silent. The man crouched slightly, trying to meet her eyes. You must be hungry. Interesting. Very interesting. Because everyone knew she was hungry. That wasn't the point. The point was power. People often reveal themselves when they think they have it. Sarah lowered her gaze. Not because she was weak. Because she was exhausted. The second man stepped forward, holding the bottle. His breath smelled strongly of whiskey. I can buy dinner. More laughter. The crowd watched. Nobody intervened. Nobody left either. People often tell themselves they are not responsible when they merely watch. History usually disagrees. The first man pulled a silver coin from his pocket, then flipped it into the dirt. It landed beside Sarah's boot. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several people looked away. Interesting. Very interesting. Because humiliation becomes harder to enjoy when it happens in front of you. Sarah stared at the coin, then at the ground. The shame burned hotter than the afternoon sun. She thought of Thomas. Again, the memory hurt. But it also helped. Because he would have wanted her to survive. No matter how ugly survival became. The first man grinned. Well, silence. Sarah's fingers tightened around the cardboard sign. The street felt smaller. The crowd felt larger. The sky felt farther away. Then another voice interrupted. Pick up the coin. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. The entire street turned. Interesting. Very interesting. Because everyone immediately knew who had spoken. The cowboy. The stranger had finally stopped his horse. Several yards away. Watching. The first man laughed. Apparently relieved. Good. An audience. Bullies enjoy audiences. He looked toward the rider. Mind your business. The cowboy nodded once. A surprisingly calm reaction. Then he repeated himself. Pick up the coin. Silence. The crowd became very quiet. Because something about the cowboy's voice felt different. Not angry. Not threatening. Certain. The first man smirked. Then kicked dust over the coin. The gesture drew nervous laughter. Not much. Enough. Interesting. Very. Interesting. Because confidence often disappears when nobody joins in. The cowboy slowly dismounted. No hurry. No drama. No threats. He tied his horse to a post. Then walked toward the group. One step. Then another. Then another. The street remained silent. The whiskey bottle suddenly looked less impressive. So did the smiles. The stranger stopped beside Sarah. For the first time, she saw him clearly. Perhaps 40 years old. Weathered face. Gray eyes. Calm expression. Nothing remarkable. Except the stillness. The man carried himself like someone who had already proven everything he needed to prove. The cowboy looked at the coin buried beneath dust. Then looked at the man responsible. You dropped something. Interesting. Very interesting. The crowd almost laughed. Almost. But nobody did, because somehow the situation no longer felt funny. The first man folded his arms. And what if I did? Silence. The cowboy glanced toward Sarah, then back toward him, then pick it up. The standoff lasted several seconds. Long enough for discomfort to spread. Long enough for common sense to finally arrive. The first man bent down, grabbed the coin, then shoved it back into his pocket. Laughter vanished completely. The crowd suddenly found other things to look at. Store windows, wagons, clouds, anything. The cowboy nodded, satisfied, as though the matter were settled. Then he did something nobody expected. He looked at Sarah, not at the sign, not at her clothes, not at her circumstances, at her. Interesting, very interesting, because it had been a long time since anyone had done that. The question that followed was simple, almost painfully simple. When did you last eat? Silence. Sarah blinked, certain she had misheard. The cowboy waited, patiently. The question came again. When did you last eat? Not what happened, not what she offered, not why she was there. Food. Only food. The woman felt tears threatening again. 3 days of fear. 3 days of shame. 3 days of hunger. And this was the first person asking the correct question. Finally she answered. Yesterday morning. The cowboy frowned. Slightly. Only slightly. Enough. Then he nodded, as though confirming something. The crowd listened carefully now. Very carefully. Because the atmosphere had changed. The stranger reached into his coat, pulled out several bills, then folded them, without counting, without hesitation. He handed them to the owner of the cafe across the street. The owner froze. Everyone did. The amount looked substantial. Very substantial. The cowboy pointed toward Sarah. Feed her. The cafe owner blinked. How long? The stranger looked toward Sarah, then back toward the owner. His answer stunned the entire street. Until she's no longer hungry. Silence. Complete silence. Interesting. Very interesting. Because nobody expected generosity. Not here. Not today. Not after reading that sign. The cafe owner slowly nodded. The money disappeared into his pocket. The agreement was made. Sarah stared, unable to speak, unable to understand. The cowboy finally looked down at the cardboard sign. The same sign everyone else had been staring at all day. Then he reached for it. The crowd leaned forward, waiting, watching, wondering. The stranger folded the sign once, then twice, then tucked it inside his coat, and quietly spoke words that sent a shock through Dry Creek. I'll take her. The crowd erupted instantly. Laughter, whispers, jokes. The entire town thought they understood exactly what he meant. Only the cowboy remained silent. And somehow, that silence was far more dangerous than any explanation. The laughter followed them, all the way across the street. Interesting, very interesting, because people always laugh when they think they understand a story, especially when they're wrong. Sarah walked beside the cowboy, slowly, carefully, almost uncertain her legs could still support her. The long day had drained everything. Her strength, her pride, her hope. The crowd watched them move toward the cafe. Whispers followed. Jokes followed. Assumptions followed. Nobody seemed interested in asking questions. Answers require effort. Assumptions are free. The cafe owner opened the door. Immediately. Very quickly. Interesting. Very interesting. Because money changes hospitality. The owner suddenly became extremely helpful. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the room. Warm. Inviting. Almost painful. Sarah hadn't realized how hungry she truly was until that moment. The cowboy motioned toward a table near the window. Sit. She obeyed, mostly because she lacked the energy to argue. The stranger removed his hat, then sat across from her. For several moments neither spoke. The owner hurried over, waiting, eager. The cowboy glanced toward Sarah. What do you want? The question surprised her, completely, because nobody had asked what she wanted in a very long time. Life had become a series of accepting whatever remained, whatever survived, whatever others allowed. Sarah looked down, embarrassed. I don't know. Interesting. Very interesting. The answer sounded sadder than hunger. The cowboy nodded, apparently understanding, then ordered anyway. Stew, bread, coffee, pie. Enough food for 3 people, maybe 4. The owner hurried away. The silence returned. Outside the cafe window, people continued watching, like spectators at a show. The cowboy seemed unconcerned. Eventually, Sarah found the courage to speak. Why? A simple question. A fair question. The stranger looked up. Why what? The woman hesitated. then gestured vaguely toward everything. The food, the money, the sign now folded inside his coat. All of it. The cowboy leaned back slightly, thinking, then shrugged. You looked hungry. Interesting. Very interesting. Sarah stared, certain there had to be more. People don't spend money like that for strangers. Not usually. The answer sounded incomplete. The cowboy seemed to notice. A faint smile appeared. Not mocking, not amused, just patient. Then he added, so I bought food. The simplicity somehow made the explanation stronger, not weaker. The owner returned carrying steaming bowls. The smell filled the room instantly. Sarah's stomach tightened painfully. The reaction embarrassed her. The cowboy pretended not to notice, which somehow felt kind. Very kind. Eat. She did. At first slowly, carefully, trying to remain polite, trying to maintain dignity. That lasted approximately 30 seconds. Then hunger won. The woman ate, and ate, and ate. Interesting. Very interesting. Because the cowboy never commented. Never. Stared. Never smiled. He simply drank coffee and watched the street, giving her privacy while sitting 3 feet away. A rare skill. Outside, the crowd gradually lost interest. People returned to work, returned to stores, returned to their lives. Only a few remained, watching, waiting, expecting something scandalous, something ugly, something familiar. Unfortunately for them, nothing happened. When Sarah finally finished eating, she leaned back in her chair, exhausted, full, almost dizzy. It had been so long since she'd eaten properly that the feeling seemed strange. The cowboy nodded toward her empty bowl. Better. She almost cried again. Not because of the food, because of the question. Nobody had asked if she was better. Nobody. For months. Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice. The stranger stood, placed several more bills on the table, then reached for his hat. The woman immediately became tense. Interesting. Very interesting. Because reality returned. The sign, the street, the agreement, the reason everyone had laughed. Fear crept back into her chest. Slowly, the cowboy noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything. The stranger studied her expression for a moment, then finally understood. And when he did, something changed in his eyes. Not anger, disappointment, not directed at Sarah, directed elsewhere. Perhaps at the town, perhaps at the world, perhaps both. The cowboy sat back down, removing his hat again. Apparently the conversation wasn't finished. Good, because something needed saying. Sarah stared at the table, then quietly asked, what happens now? Silence. The cafe seemed unusually still. Even the owner stopped pretending not to listen. The cowboy folded his hands, then answered. Honestly, the same way he had answered everything else. Now you rest. Sarah blinked. What? You rest. The woman frowned, confused. The answer made no sense. Not after the sign. Not after the crowd. Not after his words outside. The cowboy looked toward the hotel across the street, then pointed. I rented a room. Silence. Complete silence. Interesting. Very interesting. Because the entire meaning of the day suddenly shifted. Sarah stared, unable to process the sentence. The stranger continued. 2 weeks. Another pause. Paid in advance. The woman felt the room spinning slightly. Not from weakness. From disbelief. The cowboy looked directly at her. For the first time. Not through her. Not around her. At her. Then spoke the words she would remember for the rest of her life. You've been surviving. A pause. Now start recovering. Silence. Outside the window, a wagon rattled past. The late afternoon sun painted the street gold. Inside the cafe, Sarah simply stared. Because nobody had offered her recovery before. People offered pity. People offered advice. People offered judgment. Recovery was different. The cowboy stood again. This time for real. The conversation was ending. The woman quickly rose too. Panic appearing. Wait. The stranger paused. Sarah swallowed. Hard. Why are you doing this? Interesting. Very interesting. The question finally reached the center of everything. The real question. The one hiding beneath all the others. Why? The cowboy looked toward the dusty street outside. Toward the place where she'd sat all day. Then his gaze settled on the folded sign inside his coat. When he finally answered, his voice was quiet. Very quiet. Yet every word landed. Because 10 years ago. A pause. Someone did the same thing for me. Silence. Sarah froze. The cowboy adjusted his hat, then stepped toward the door. But before leaving, He turned back one final time and said something that made absolutely no sense. At least not yet. Tomorrow morning. A pause. Meet me at the North Road. Sarah frowned. Confused. The stranger opened the door. Sunlight flooded the cafe. Then he spoke the sentence that would change her life forever. There's something I want to show you. Sarah barely slept. Not because the hotel room was uncomfortable. The opposite. Interesting. Very interesting. Because comfort can feel strange after living with fear. The mattress was soft. The blankets were clean. The room was quiet. Yet Sarah spent most of the night staring at the ceiling. Thinking. Wondering. Questioning. Who was the cowboy? Why had he helped her? What exactly did he mean when he said he would take her? And, most importantly, what did he want? The questions followed her until dawn. When morning finally arrived, Sarah stood by the window, looking out toward Dry Creek. The town already looked different. Not because it had changed. Because she had. Yesterday she sat in the dirt holding a sign. Today she stood inside a room with a locked door. A bed. A meal in her stomach. Safety. Interesting. Very interesting. Sometimes hope returns quietly. So quietly you almost miss it. At precisely 8 o'clock, Sarah walked toward the North Road. The same road leading away from town. The same road most travelers used. The cowboy was already there. Waiting. Mounted on his horse. As calm as ever. He tipped his hat slightly when he saw her. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. Just acknowledgement. The woman stopped several feet away. Unsure what to say? The cowboy saved her from the awkwardness. Ready? Sarah frowned. For what? The faintest smile appeared. To see what I bought. Silence. Interesting. Very interesting. Because the sentence sounded exactly as terrible as everyone in town imagined. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. The cowboy noticed. Of course he noticed. Again. He noticed everything. The smile disappeared immediately. Then Wyatt sighed softly, apparently realizing how his words sounded. Not you. A pause. The place. Confusion replaced fear. Only slightly. Enough. The cowboy gestured toward a wagon waiting nearby. Come on. The journey lasted nearly an hour. They traveled beyond Dry Creek. Beyond the farms. Beyond the grazing fields. Toward a neglected section of countryside few people visited anymore. The landscape slowly changed. Old fences. Abandoned corrals. Weathered buildings. The remains of forgotten dreams. Interesting. Very interesting. Because the place looked familiar. Not personally familiar. Emotionally familiar. It looked like loss. Finally Wyatt stopped his horse. Sarah climbed from the wagon. Then stared. Several acres stretched before her. A farmhouse. A barn. A water well. Fields. Everything worn by time. Everything damaged. Yet somehow still standing. The woman looked around. Confused. This is what you wanted to show me. Wyatt nodded. Yes. Silence. The wind moved across the empty property. Grass swayed gently. An old gate creaked somewhere in the distance. The place felt lonely. Very lonely. Then Sarah noticed something. Fresh lumber. New tools. Construction supplies. Interesting. Very interesting. Someone had been working here. Recently. The cowboy followed her gaze. Good. He nodded. You noticed. Sarah looked at him. Then back at the farmhouse. Then back at him again. What is this place? The answer came immediately. Without hesitation. Without drama. My mother's ranch. Silence. The words carried weight. The kind people don't fake. Sarah looked around again. The property suddenly felt different. More personal. More meaningful. Wyatt walked toward the porch. Slowly. The woman followed. The boards creaked beneath their boots. Eventually the cowboy stopped beside an old rocking chair. Weathered. Faded. Still intact. My mother sat there every evening. Interesting. Very interesting. Because it was the first personal thing Wyatt had shared. The first glimpse behind the calm expression. The first crack in the wall. Sarah remained silent. Listening. Wyatt looked toward the distant hills. My father died when I was young. A pause. Then drought came. Another pause. Then death. The pattern sounded familiar. Painfully familiar. Sarah understood immediately. Because loss speaks the same language everywhere. The cowboy continued. We almost lost everything. The woman looked down. Remembering her own story. The cabin. Thomas. The debts. The sign. Interesting. Very interesting. Two strangers. Different lives. The same scars. Wyatt pointed toward the farmhouse. My mother never gave up. Silence. People helped her. A pause. That's the only reason we survived. The words hung in the air. Suddenly, Sarah remembered something. The cafe. The day before. Someone helped me too. The realization arrived quietly, yet powerfully. Wyatt looked directly at her, then finally revealed the truth. The truth nobody in Dry Creek understood. The truth hidden behind every rumor, every laugh, every assumption. I didn't buy you. Silence. The wind seemed to stop. The world seemed to pause. Interesting. Very interesting. Because Sarah hadn't realized how badly she needed to hear those words. The cowboy continued. I bought time. A pause. I bought safety. Another pause. I bought breathing room. The woman felt tears forming. Again. But these were different tears. Not humiliation. Not fear. Relief. Pure relief. Wyatt looked around the property. Then toward the farmhouse. Then back toward Sarah. This place is going to become a shelter. Confusion returned. Immediately. A shelter. The cowboy nodded. For widows. A pause. For abandoned women. Another pause. For people who need a second chance. Sarah stared. Unable to speak. Unable to process everything. The ranch. The hotel room. The food. The kindness. It suddenly fit together. Like pieces of a puzzle. Interesting. Very interesting. Because Wyatt had never been rescuing her. Not exactly. He was building something. Something larger than one person. Something larger than one act of kindness. The cowboy looked toward the farmhouse. Then said the last thing Sarah expected. I can't do it alone. Silence. The woman blinked. Certain she misunderstood. Wyatt shook his head, apparently reading her thoughts. Again. I need help. A pause. Then came the question. Simple. Life-changing. Terrifying. Would you like to stay? The wind moved through the fields. The old ranch waited. The future waited. And for the first time since Thomas died, Sarah Collins saw something she thought was gone forever. A road forward. The question lingered in the air. Would you like to stay? Interesting. Very interesting. Because 6 months earlier Sarah would have answered immediately. Back then she knew exactly where she belonged. Her home. Her garden. Her husband. Her future. Now everything felt different. Uncertain. Fragile. The wind moved across the fields. The old ranch waited quietly. Wyatt waited too. Patiently. Without pressure. Without expectation. Sarah looked toward the farmhouse. The peeling paint. The broken shutters. The weathered porch. None of it looked impressive. Yet somehow, it felt more welcoming than any place she'd seen in months. The woman swallowed hard. Then nodded. A small nod. Almost invisible. Enough. Wyatt smiled. Only slightly. The same way he always smiled. As though happiness was something private. Not something to display. Good. That was all he said. Good. Interesting. Very interesting. Because some people make promises. Others make speeches. Wyatt simply opened a door. Then allowed people to walk through it. The following weeks passed quickly. Much faster than Sarah expected. Every morning began before sunrise. Work started early. The farmhouse needed repairs. The barn needed repairs. The fencing needed repairs. Everything needed repairs. The place had spent years waiting for someone to care about it again. Now someone finally did. Several someones. Interesting. Very interesting. Because Sarah wasn't alone for long. 2 weeks after arriving, another widow appeared. Then another. Then another. News traveled slowly across Texas. But kindness traveled too. Especially rare kindness. One woman arrived from Abilene. Another came from a failed mining settlement. A third escaped an abusive employer. Each carried a different story, different scars, different losses. Yet all arrived carrying the same thing. Fear. The kind Sarah knew well. The kind she recognized immediately. And each time a new woman arrived, Sarah greeted her, showed her a room, shared a meal, offered a smile. Interesting. Very interesting. Because months earlier Sarah had needed saving. Now she was helping save others. That realization frightened her at first, then strengthened her. The transformation happened slowly. The best ones usually do. Meanwhile, Wyatt continued working. Repairing roofs. Fixing fences. Digging wells. Hauling lumber. The cowboy never acted like the owner. Never acted like a hero. Never reminded anyone what he'd done. Most days he seemed happiest when nobody mentioned it. One afternoon, Sarah watched him repair part of the barn roof. The Texas sun burned overhead. Sweat soaked through his shirt. The work looked exhausting. The woman climbed the ladder carrying water. When she reached the top, Wyatt accepted the cup, nodded, drank, then returned to work. Interesting. Very interesting. because after all these weeks, Sarah still knew surprisingly little about him. Eventually, curiosity won. What made you start this place? Wyatt kept working. For a while, then answered, my mother. The response surprised her. Only slightly. Enough. The cowboy hammered another board into place. My mother spent years helping people. A pause. Even when she barely had enough for herself. Sarah listened. The wind moved through the fields below. The ranch felt alive now. Different. The cowboy looked toward the horizon. When she died. Silence. I inherited the land. Another silence. I didn't know what to do with it. Interesting. Very interesting. Because grief had shaped both of them. Not identically, but similarly. The cowboy smiled faintly. Then I remembered what she used to say. Sarah waited. The words came quietly, as though repeating something sacred. If you've been helped. A pause. Help someone else. The sentence stayed with Sarah for the rest of the day. And the day after that. And the day after that. Because deep down, she realized that's exactly what Wyatt was doing. Months passed. The shelter grew. The farmhouse became warmer. Safer. Stronger. The barn filled with supplies. The fields began producing crops again. Life returned. Not the old life. A new one. Perhaps a better one. Then one afternoon, a familiar wagon appeared. Interesting. Very interesting. Because Sarah recognized it immediately. Dry Creek. The town. The past. The wagon stopped near the front gate. And climbing down from it was the last person she expected to see. The saloon owner. The same man who laughed. The same man who watched. The same man who treated her humiliation like entertainment. For a moment, old memories returned. The sign. The dirt. The crowd. The shame. All of it. The man removed his hat awkwardly. Apparently uncomfortable. Good. He should have been. The former saloon owner looked older now. More tired. More worried. Business had collapsed after a harsh season. Debt followed. Then failure. Interesting. Very interesting. The same road many others had traveled before him. He stood quietly near the gate, unsure whether to continue, unsure whether to leave. Finally he spoke. I heard what you're doing here. Sarah said nothing. The man lowered his eyes, then continued. My sister lost her husband. A pause. And her home. Another pause. She needs help. Silence. The ranch seemed unusually quiet. Even the wind felt still. The man finally looked at Sarah. Embarrassment filled his face. Real embarrassment. Not performative. Not convenient. Real. I know I don't deserve to ask. Interesting. Very interesting. Because for the first time since Sarah met him, he was speaking honestly. The woman looked toward the farmhouse. Toward the women working together. Toward the life she'd rebuilt. Then she remembered something. The coin in the dirt. The laughter. The crowd. The humiliation. Every reason to refuse. Every reason to walk away. Every reason to let him suffer. And yet, Wyatt's mother's words returned. If you've been helped, help someone else. Sarah looked back at the man, then simply said, bring her tomorrow. The saloon owner froze. Completely. Apparently expecting anger. Or revenge. Or rejection. Instead he received mercy. The one thing he hadn't earned. The one thing he desperately needed. His eyes lowered. Then he nodded, unable to speak. As he climbed back into the wagon, Wyatt stepped onto the porch. He had witnessed everything. Every word. Every choice. The wagon disappeared down the road. Silence returned. The cowboy looked toward Sarah, then smiled. A real smile this time. Rare. Warm. Proud. And for the first time, Sarah understood what Wyatt had truly bought that day in Dry Creek. Not a woman. Not a promise. Not a debt. He had bought something much more valuable. A second chance. And now, she was giving that same gift to someone else. Spring arrived quietly. Interesting. Very interesting. Because most important changes do. Not with noise. Not with celebration. Not with announcements. Just one day at a time. One sunrise at a time. One small act of kindness at a time. The ranch no longer looked abandoned. Not even close. Fresh paint covered the farmhouse. The fences stood straight. The fields produced vegetables again. Flower boxes appeared beneath the windows. The old property that once resembled a forgotten memory now felt alive. Very alive. Women worked in the gardens. Children played beneath the trees. Laughter drifted across the fields. Real laughter. The kind that comes after hardship. The kind people appreciate because they remember life without it. Interesting. Very interesting. Because only a year earlier, none of this existed. Sarah stood on the front porch. looking across the property. The same porch where Wyatt first explained his dream. The same porch where she first believed her life might not be over. The woman smiled softly. Not because life was perfect, because life was meaningful. There is a difference. A very important difference. Behind her, the screen door opened. A young widow stepped outside. One of the newest arrivals. Her name was Emily. 23 years old. Terrified. Homeless. Pregnant. Sarah recognized the fear immediately, because she remembered carrying it herself. Emily hesitated, then quietly asked, "Do you think things get better?" Interesting. Very interesting. Because it was exactly the question Sarah once wanted someone to answer. The woman looked toward the fields, thinking, remembering, then smiled. Yes. A pause. They do. Emily nodded slowly, wanting to believe, needing to believe. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, then added, but not all at once. The young woman listened carefully. As long as you keep walking forward. A pause, even when it's only one step. Emily smiled. Just a little. Enough. The same smile Sarah herself had worn months earlier. Hope beginning to return. The cycle continued. Exactly as Wyatt intended. Interesting. Very interesting. Because kindness grows differently than most things. The more you give away, the more appears. Later that afternoon, another wagon arrived from Dry Creek. Nobody found that unusual anymore. The shelter had become known throughout the region. People came seeking help, seeking work, seeking safety, seeking a second chance. The driver climbed down, then handed Sarah an envelope. No return address. No explanation. Just her name written across the front. The woman opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. She immediately recognized the handwriting. The former saloon owner. The man who once laughed while she sat in the dirt. Interesting. Very interesting. The letter was short. Simple. Honest. The best letters usually are. Sarah read quietly. Then read it again. The man wrote about his sister. How she now worked in the kitchen. How she smiled again. How she spoke about the future. The letter ended with a sentence that stopped Sarah completely. I laughed when people treated you like you were worth less than a meal. A pause. I'll regret that for the rest of my life. Silence. The wind moved softly across the porch. Sarah folded the letter carefully. Not because of the apology. Because of what it represented. Growth. People changing. People becoming better. The same thing Wyatt had believed was possible all along. That evening the ranch gathered for supper. Long wooden tables filled the yard. Lanterns glowed softly. Children laughed. Women shared stories. The air smelled of fresh bread and stew. A home. That was what it had become. A home. Interesting. Very interesting. Because home isn't always a place you start. Sometimes it's a place you build. One person at a time. One choice at a time. Across the yard, Wyatt sat quietly near the edge of the gathering. As usual. Never seeking attention. Never standing at the center. The cowboy seemed perfectly comfortable remaining in the background. Sarah walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one. He accepted. Nodded. The same way he always did. For several moments, they simply watched the people. The children. The families. The life surrounding them. Finally Sarah spoke. Did you ever think it would become this? Wyatt looked around. The lanterns. The laughter. The shelter. The future. Then smiled. A small smile. The familiar smile. No. Sarah laughed softly. Really? The cowboy shook his head. I hoped. Interesting. Very interesting. Because hope and certainty are not the same thing. Hope requires courage. Certainty does not. The ranch grew quiet as darkness settled across the land. Stars appeared overhead. One by one. The way they always had. The way they always would. Eventually the conversations faded. The children slept. The lanterns dimmed. And the evening became still. Sarah remained on the porch long after everyone else retired, looking out across the property, thinking, remembering, the sign, the street, the hunger, the humiliation, the coin in the dirt, the laughter, all of it. It felt like another lifetime. Yet she remembered every detail. Because some moments never leave you. Then she noticed something, mounted on the wall near the entrance, protected behind a simple wooden frame, a faded piece of cardboard. Interesting. Very interesting. Sarah immediately recognized it. The sign. The original sign. 1 meal equals 1 night. Her breath caught. The woman stared. Speechless. At some point Wyatt had recovered it. Preserved it. Kept it. Not as a reminder of shame. As a reminder of survival. The cowboy stepped onto the porch behind her. Quietly, as always. Sarah looked toward him, then toward the framed sign, then back toward him. Why did you keep it? Silence. Wyatt studied the old cardboard, then answered. Because the answer mattered. It reminds us. A pause. How close people can come to giving up. The woman listened. The cowboy continued. And how little it sometimes takes to help them keep going. Silence. The stars shone overhead. The ranch rested peacefully beneath them. Sarah looked once more at the sign, then across the home they had built. The women, the children, the second chances, the lives restored. And finally she understood. The day she sat in the dirt. The town saw a price. Wyatt saw a person. That was the difference. That was always the difference. The sign never defined her. Her worst day never defined her. Her hunger never defined her. Her strength did. Her kindness did. Her choice to keep going did. And in the end, the woman they thought desperation would break became the woman who helped others stand again. The land remembers kindness. And sometimes, one meal can change far more than a single night.